أهلا وسهلا بكم مجددا. شكرا للترجمة الفورية، غلبتك أنا معي بحكي بسرعة. Okay, so our third session will be chaired by Mr. Mark فرينغس. Sorry, I'm speaking English. مدير مؤسسة كونراد أدناور شتيفتونغ. I was listening. Thank you. Okay, that's it. كان لي شرف طبعا أعرفه صباح هذا اليوم، ولنا شرف إنه موجود دائما بيننا، صديق أكثر ما هو داعم. وبهذا اليوم المحور رح يكون حصيلة أبحاث مهمة قامت بها دار الكلمة الجامعية بدعم مؤسسة طبعا كونراد، واستبيانات أرقام الأولى من نوعها. جلسة مثمرة وممتعة بنتمناها لكم.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you very much for being surrounded by three experts. I'm sorry, it's the first male-only panel, as I've realized when I checked the program. All the other panels also have female experts. I don't know what happened here.
Actually, Varsin was...
Yeah, I know. Varsin could have rescued us. Unfortunately, she didn't make it, but I'm very, very grateful that Maha is replacing both Jamil and Varsin to give the empirical findings later. I was already introduced, Mark from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Who owns Jerusalem? I think this is a question that puzzles us all, not only throughout the conference, but if you recall what we have discussed already, one has to say that there are many different angles and many different responses on this question, who owns this city? And I think it becomes notably critical when we talk about the religious dimension. And this panel and the next one together will shed more light on the Christian perspective on the city. It will focus on the Christian identity of Jerusalem with experts that I think are not necessarily to be introduced. Mitri Rahab, we have Khafeeir from the NSU, from the National Support Unit of the PLO for future negotiations with Israel, and Maher Tammuz, who was involved in the research of the work that should have been originally presented by Jamil Rabach and Varsin Agabekian. I think that especially Christians are somehow forced to adjust in a very cursive environment. We are talking about many different identities that the Palestinian can take, being Palestinian, being Arab, but also being a religious person. I think all of this leads to ambiguity and to the need to adjust to these realities. And I think it becomes even more challenging when we dig deeper into this Christian perspective. And I think especially when we also talk about the topics about the Christian organizations and the political history of Palestinian Christian actors during the first half of the 20th century and the different denominations being present until today. We have 1 hour 15 approximately, which means that every speaker will get 15 minutes, followed by a Q&A. And we start with the historical approach and with the presentation by Khafeeir Abouid. Khafeeir, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. I just have to do a couple of disclosures before we start this presentation. First of all, what I'm going to present is part of a larger research I'm doing on the political history of Palestinian Christians in Jerusalem, but from 1917 up until now. So it was a bit difficult to reduce what I had between 1917 and 1948. The second part is that everything I'm going to say are my opinions. They not necessarily represent the PLO where I work. And I think you'll realize basically why I'm making this disclosure as I am speaking about the role of foreign churches, foreign heads of churches, and foreign countries here in Palestine between 1917 and 1948. Now, when Lord Balfour gave his commitment to the Zionist movement in November 1917, British troops were not even in Jerusalem. It was a month after that happened. But the fate of Palestine was somehow played through the great powers at that time. Palestinians did not know about the Balfour Declaration till later on. And I think that's one of the reasons why for many Palestinian Christians, and even also some Palestinian Muslims, the entry of British troops in Jerusalem was actually a reason to be happy about. They were coming from a very difficult economic situation under the last years of the Ottoman period in Palestine, and therefore many, both outside and inside Palestine, even saw the British victory as a victory for Christianity. But when we start to analyze a little bit more on the roots of the Balfour Declaration, on how the Balfour Declaration came to be, then we realize that we are talking about perhaps two different kinds of Christianity. Very few people talk about the Zionist Christian origin, or at least the influence that Christian Zionism had on Lord James Balfour, who came from a Protestant family that was very close and familiar with the idea of Jews coming to Palestine as part of a divine mandate. And in fact, if we go to the origins of Christian Zionism, it's not in the US, it's actually in the United Kingdom or in other parts of Europe some centuries ago. This Palestine that the Turks left in 1917 and the Brits took over had a population of about 618,000 Muslims, 70,000 Christians, and about 59,000 Jews that were divided also between local Jews and foreign Jews. Now, when we start realizing the Christian Zionist nature of Mr. Balfour, I think there is a very important quote of Balfour which reflects very well what I'm referring to as those two kinds of Christianity that we may be talking about throughout this presentation. Lord Balfour said, "Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires or prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit this ancient land." Now, it's important when we talk about Palestinian Christians, by 1917, at least to map them, it will take a few seconds. We had 13 churches in accordance to the status quo of the holy sites. I think that's one of the most important elements when we talk about the differences in the approach between the heads of churches on one side that would care much more about the status quo of the holy sites than their communities on the other side that took a very nationalistic approach, as we are going to see. Now, it's true we had 13 churches, but that were divided, as some of you know, in three main groups: the Western churches, Roman Catholics, Greek Catholics, Armenian Catholics, and others. You have the Eastern churches, mainly the Greek Orthodox, but also the Syrian Orthodox, Armenians, etc., and the Protestant churches that were mainly Anglicans and Lutherans. From all the 13 churches, there were mainly 3 or 4 that were more prominent in Palestine. The majority were Greek Orthodox. On one side, we had a group of, or a fast-growing church, which was the Roman Catholic Church, especially since the reestablishment of the Latin Patriarchate back in 1847. And we also had the Greek Catholic Church, very important to analyze the Palestinian national movement during the British Mandate. Not because they were particularly prominent in Jerusalem. They were a very small community until now in Jerusalem. They were very important in the Galilee. They were very prominent. And one of the most important figures of the Palestinian national movement back at that time was the only head of church in this land that was an Arab, Bishop Gregorios Hajjar from the Greek Catholic Church, who later on, according to Palestinian history, would be assassinated by the British Mandate back in 1940 because of his strong positions. When we talk about the status quo of the holy sites, we're talking about the main concern of the heads of those main churches. The status quo comes back to centuries, but the status quo we know about today, it comes mainly from 1852, a document written by the Ottoman authorities, and it was confirmed by the Treaty of Berlin back in 1878. When the Brits take over Palestine, Article 13 of the mandate confirmed that they were going to respect the status quo of all holy sites, not only Christian sites, and that's very important when we talk about the Burak square that for some people is referred to as the Wailing Wall as well. Article 14 of the British Mandate said that if there were many problems in terms of the status quo, there would be a special international committee that never took place. At the end, it was the Brits that took over all the decisions. But there is also a very important element that was ratified by the British authorities. By reaffirming the status quo, they also reaffirmed the role of some foreign countries here as kind of guarantors of the Christian presence or Christian rights. And there we talk about France, we talk about Spain, we talk about Belgium, we talk about Italy. And I think it's very relevant because for Palestinian Christians, it's just normal to see the French Consul General or the Italian Consul General coming to the Nativity Church on the Christmas Eve, as it is just part of the landscape. But it comes with a responsibility that I think we may want to question whether those countries are really conducting or not, which is the protection of the Christian communities here. And when we see the politics of some of those governments voting, for example, in UNESCO against resolutions to save the Christian and Muslim identity of the holy sites in Jerusalem, we may also want to question a little bit what's the real role of those countries that are supposed to protect the Christians. Then we have to add Greece in the case of the Greek Orthodox. Now, the divisions between the heads of churches and their communities are very clear when we talk particularly about the Greek Orthodox Church. The Greek Orthodox Church had a patriarch by the beginning of the British Mandate, Patriarch Damianos, who did not only disregard the national rights of his community, he was against the national rights of his communities. And I think a very important element that for some people that follow the news here will sound very familiar. When I ask people, when was the first time that the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem sold or leased a piece of land to Zionists? Because some of the excuses are that they have to deal with occupation after 1967. Well, the first piece of land was sold in 1923. So it was basically with the beginning of the British Mandate, with the Balfour Declaration, that even though their community was asking the head of church, Patriarch Damianos in particular, not to sell the land, he went on and sold it. We can talk later on in the Q&A about the reasons that they presented in order to do that. But also, when we talk about the Catholics, it's also very interesting the process that the Catholic churches, with the exception of the Greek Catholics that were very Arab and very nationalistic, were having. The Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem was reinstated only in 1847. And the main reason why they were reinstated is because the Franciscans that were here for almost 700 years did not have a local clergy. They did not believe that Palestinians could actually become priests. And one of the main problems that they had even before the British Mandate started was when Patriarch Valerga, the first Latin patriarch back in 1947, decided to open a local seminary for Palestinians. It was a clash, actually, between the foreign heads of churches and Patriarch Valerga that, for his credit, would actually go ahead and say that a local church without local clergy, it's something like a ghost, which I think would have been a message for the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. The Latin Patriarchate, though, did not really take a position or a clear position as Latin Patriarchate against the Balfour Declaration or against the Zionist narrative. They did have, though, and that's a very interesting story of the British Mandate, a very strong patriarch, Luis Berlazzina. And if you go and ask Palestinian historians in general, they'll say that Berlazzina was very anti-Zionist and very anti-British. But when you go digging a little bit more into history, you realize that Luis Berlazzina indeed was a very strong patriarch. He was anti-British, but not because he supported Palestinian national rights. He was very Italian. He really wanted the Italians to take over, and if not the Italians, the French that were Catholics, not the Protestants that came with the UK. In fact, even though he was very anti-Zionist and he was against the British mandate, he would try to ask his own community not to take part in the Palestinian national movement. Now, when we talk about going back on the issue of selling the land of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, the main consequence was that the Arab Orthodox clubs, and I'm sure you hear about the Orthodox club in Beit Sahur or Beit Jal or Jerusalem, well, the Arab Orthodox clubs all over, even in places that today have no Christians, like Tulkarem, they got organized. They had their first conference in Haifa, and they start demanding the British mandate to take a position, because according to the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate laws, the Greek Orthodox patriarch had to be also approved by the political authority that was in charge there. That's very interesting, because this campaign led by the local Palestinian Orthodox, made by that when Patriarch Damianos died in 1931, the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate spent 4 years without a recognized patriarch. And it was only because of the organization of the local Palestinian Christians that were asking for their rights to be respected all over. Now, this issue with what some people would refer to as the Arab Orthodox cause, it became very prominent in the national movement at that time. And I think we should remember that when Isa, who's the founder and first editor of Palestine newspaper, which was the most prominent national newspaper, when he was asked after the Nakba about his activities, he said, well, I set Philistine newspaper basically because I wanted to defend the Arab Orthodox cause. And then it came out with any other considerations he had. It's very important that most of the national newspapers in Palestine and the most important magazines were also owned by Palestinian Christians and Orthodox at the same time. And it's not bad also to remember that the first Palestinian who spoke publicly against the Zionist movement and the Zionist project in Palestine was also a Palestinian Christian, Najib Nassar from Haifa, in a magazine called Al-Karmel back in 1913. Now, I know we don't have much time, but there is, in the memoir, it's not a memoir, it's in the final interview or late interview of Isa, he describes a discussion he had with Herbert Samuel. Herbert Samuel was the first British High Commissioner here, a very enthusiastic Zionist Jew. And Isa was not particularly anti-British. That's also important to say. Not all Palestinians were against the Brits. They were against the Balfour Declaration, which is something else. In his dialogue with Herbert Samuel, he describes it as follows. The High Commissioner rose to greet me, shook my hand, then said, I read your paper with a lot of interest, but without pleasure. Won't you make a truce with me and end your campaign? Sir Herbert Samuel, are you speaking to me as a Zionist leader or as a High Commissioner? I asked. High Commissioner as a leader, he replied. Then I asked, are you asking for a truce from a defender or an attacker? From an attacker, of course, he replied. I answered, Isa says, I am only defending the rights of my country in the face of a Zionist attack. So how can you ask me to be silent? You are indiscriminately spreading around any and all kinds of Zionist pronouncements. If you weren't publishing these things, we wouldn't have the tension that exists in this country, Isa said. Those kind of statements made many Zionists, and that's a very important element on this period. Many Zionists would actually, including Zionist intelligence, believe that Christian Palestinians were actually those that were moving the Palestinian national movement. And some of the reports, if we get into the reports of some Zionist intelligence reports, they even used some arguments that could be considered to be even as anti-Semitic if it was made against the Jews. Like, for example, that the Christians as a minority were manipulating the Muslims in order to take over control over the country. Now, since we have only 3 minutes left, I I'll jump perhaps to the most important moment during the British Mandate, which I think it's the 1947 UN partition resolution. Why I jump there? It's mainly because from the most prominent defenders of the Palestinian cause vis-a-vis the United Nations were three Palestinian Christians, Henry Qattan, Isa Nakhle, and Emil Ghori, that was the right hand of Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, the Palestinian national leader back at that time. It's particularly interesting to see the kind of defense that they would make of our cause, mainly of our national cause, not only because it would bring a distance to what their heads of churches wanted them to do, which was basically to stay away of trouble, but also for how sophisticated they were. I think it's for some people may be impressive to know that, for example, Henry Qattan was a lawyer from the London University, that Isa Nakhle was also a lawyer from the London University, that Emil Ghori was a political scientist for the Cincinnati University. Qattan. From Jerusalem. Thank you, Dr. Abdullah. And when we talk about the partition resolution, then, in my research, I could not find many statements from the heads of churches, but I could find a lot from the Holy See. The Holy See went ahead and tried to get what they referred to as a corpus separatum. So when we talk about the corpus separatum, it's basically part of the Holy See lobby on that matter. The Peel Commission, by the way, 1937, the first time that the Brits talk about the division of Palestine, it also included a kind of corpus separatum, but it was much greater. Nazareth, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, part of the Sea of the Galilee. Now you were talking about Bethlehem and Jerusalem. So when we talk about the UN partition resolution, we are talking somehow about a position that was pushed by the churches and particularly by the Holy See. On May 1st, 1948, Pope Pius XII issued the first clear statement on Jerusalem, public statement, saying, "We mean to refer to the holy places in Palestine, which have long been disturbed. Indeed, if there exists any place that ought to be most dear to every cultured person, surely it is Palestine, where from the dawn of antiquity, such great light of truth shone for all men." It may not be such a politicized statement, but it was a preamble to what I believe it's the most politicized statement that came out from the Holy See. May 14, 1948, by the end of the British Mandate, where they basically say something that many churches today refuse to say or say it very silently, which is that the promise that you see in the Bible is not applicable to the reality you are seeing now as the state of Israel is a secular state. That's how the Vatican referred to, and it's not a divine mandate given by God to any chosen people. In fact, the Vatican said that the chosen people or the people of Israel at that time were the Christians because they had followed that. That's part of, and I'm sure you know this part of the history. Now, just to conclude, I'm not going to talk much about 1948. I can just say that all churches lost communities in Palestine. The Roman Catholic Church lost at least 5 communities completely. And in the case of Jerusalem, we are talking about Ein Karem as the most important community that was ethnically cleansed back in 1948. They also lost, in addition to Bishop Hajjar, another priest, Father Dipsy, that was also assassinated in the early 40s. And Palestinian history also claims that it was the British mandate behind his assassination for being very strongly opposed to the Zionist project. And if we analyze by the end of the British mandate, the Balfour Declaration was implemented. The demography of Palestine had changed, the demography of Jerusalem had changed. And I would just, even though you may believe that, from one side, for example, the Anglican Church was supportive of what was happening, that's also important to say. The Anglican bishop in Palestine and Jerusalem was against the Balfour Declaration, was against turning this country into a Jewish state. So you see many different approaches. As a conclusion, we can just say that from one side, most heads of churches were trying to take care of things that were very far away from the national rights and the basic rights of their faithful. And I would just like to conclude by quoting John Leal in his memoirs as a Christian Jerusalemite. He said, "Our foolish confidence finally proved wrong. On 14 May 1948, the last British High Commissioner, Sir Alan Cunningham, left Jerusalem, and the 3 decades of British mandate over Palestine ended. In 1917, the British entered Jerusalem to the sound of trumpets, but left unceremoniously and without fanfare, plunging Jerusalem and the entire region into an endless state of chaos. I would add, the foreign heads of churches remained in the city, but most of their faithful were gone." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javier, for this presentation that I think very much also shows the lines that might have started during the British Mandate side, but definitely continue until today, because some of the patterns that you have described, I think, are very much valid also for the year 2018. But with that, we jump from the year 48 to 2018 and discuss what is entitled Jerusalem Conflicting Christian Perspectives, which will be elaborated by Reverend Dr. Mutri Raab. Mutri, the floor is yours.
Actually, my paper is, I will not read it, but I will try to summarize it. It's a larger research I'm doing currently, and actually it builds very well what we heard this morning from Ulrike Beshman and from George, and it also builds on what Khafieer said. I called it Jerusalem Conflicting Christian Perspectives, Chronology of Two Discourses. And what I'm doing here actually is trying to look at two different ways to look at Jerusalem. Both of them claim to be Christian, but actually they are totally non-reconcilable. You cannot bring both together. They are just two separate discourses. And I will do this by looking at 5 different stations of this chronology, which I think are important when we think of Jerusalem. The first is, I will start where Khafieer ends, the Corpus Separatum era. I will move to the post-67 era. 1980 was an important milestone because this is when the Knesset issued the so-called Jerusalem law. And then the Oslo era after 93, and then the current Trump era. So I will do it quickly. If we look at the first era, the Corpus Separatum, I mean, this actually was a UN resolution that was passed on November 29, 47. It said independent Arab and Jewish states, 2, and special international regime for the city of Jerusalem shall come into existence in Palestine 2 months after the evacuation of the armed forces of the mandatory power has been completed, but in any case not later than October 1st, 48. Never happened, as you know. But still, if we look at this era, we see what we heard now from Khafieer. This is again Pope Pius in his Redemptoris Nostri Cruciatus. He says, the time has come when Jerusalem and its vicinity, Bethlehem, where the previous memorials of the life and death of the divine Redeemer are preserved, should be accorded and legally guaranteed an international status, which in the present circumstances seems to offer the best and most satisfactory protection for these sacred monuments. I mean, this was said 49, which I think that was already wishful thinking, because already on April 3rd, the armistice agreement between Jordan and Israel was signed, and basically the borders were already set. And 1 month later, the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, they write to the UN reminding them of their obligation regarding the internationalization of Jerusalem. And they have 3 points. The first point says human rights and fundamental freedoms, and particularly full religious liberty, must be safeguarded for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. The protection of holy places, religious buildings, and sites in Palestine and free access thereto should be recognized as a matter of international responsibilities. This is part of the internationalization. All church-owned and mission-owned properties in Palestine that have been occupied by other Arabs or Jews should be returned to their owners. So if we look at this first era, we see actually it's the Vatican and international commissions dealing with this issue of Jerusalem. But we don't see yet the other voice that I will talk about shortly. They were still not that active. This other discourse started actually after 1967. Why after 1967? Because 1967, when Israel won the war, for many Christians worldwide, they thought this was a miracle. You know, the tiny state of Israel was able to have victory over all Arab countries. And some actually saw God fighting on the side of Israel against the Arabs. And actually, this was the start of reawakening of all fundamentalist movements. Christian fundamentalist movement, Christian Zionism, became very active after 67. Religious settlement movement became very active and was followed by the Muslim fundamentalist movement a bit later. So in this era, interestingly, 67, none of the churches talked about Jerusalem. They were all busy with talking about, let's find a solution. But Jerusalem was, interestingly enough, not mentioned in any of the document, at least I looked at. But what we find is this discourse starts in the late 60s, which is an interesting discourse, I think. Here, the World Council of Churches Central Committee is saying, we recommend that serious consideration be given by the appropriate department of the World Council of Churches to initiating discussions with Christians, Jews, and Muslims as to the guardianship of the holy places, the status of Jerusalem, and the people of the city. So basically here, this is the start with something I call the dialogue trail, which again, in the 70s, many Palestinians were engaged in and actually led to later, I think, to Oslo somehow. But if we look at this era, and again on this one discourse of the World Council of Churches, this is what I focus on mostly because we have all the documents, so you can trace their thinking. They were thinking here again in Nairobi, 75, the monotheistic religions must cooperate together to ensure that Jerusalem is a city open to the adherents of all three religions and wherein they can meet and live together. In any agreement concerning Jerusalem, it is crucial to abide by the special legislation regulating the relationship of the Christian communities and authorities guaranteed by international treaties and the League of Nations known as the status quo. This is always a very important thing, the status quo, because it's about ownership and control. Third, it's essential to highlight that the Holy Land places should not become mere monument of visitations, but must rather serve as living places of worship for Christian communities who have maintained their roots and daily lives within the holy city. And the future of Jerusalem can only be settled in a comprehensive, peaceful context and under international aegis and guarantees. Here, again, it's not anymore internalization, but international guarantees. The same thing we see in 74. The Central Committee affirms that in order to reach a satisfactory position regarding Jerusalem, the following facts should be taken into account. Jerusalem is holy city for three monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The tendency to minimize Jerusalem's importance for any of these three religions should be avoided. Again, I mean, keep this in mind. This is one discourse, because this is totally opposite of what is happening under Trump. But the question of Jerusalem is not only a matter of protection of holy places, it is organically linked with living faith and communities of peoples in the holy city. Any solution in Jerusalem should take into account the rights and needs of the indigenous peoples of the holy city. We are of the opinion that matters related to jurisdiction over Jerusalem will only find their lasting solution within the context of the settlement of the conflict in its totality. So this is what the World Council of Churches was basically saying. But now let's look. So this is the one discourse. It's somehow, it's logic in the way of its thinking, and it will continue like that. But it's very specific discourse. If we look now at the other discourse, which I call the rebirth of Christian Zionism, 1967, the most important song in Jerusalem, in Israel, was Jerusalem City of Gold, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. And the interesting thing, this song was not only sang by the Jewish Israeli. I remember being, in youth work in Germany as students, and we were singing this in the youth work, which is, it's unbelievable. Why would you sing this? And it shows Jerusalem as a deserted city, and now finally, the Israeli soldiers come and it's liberated, and all of this kind of discourse. So while the World Council of Churches were talking about, this dialogue, three monotheistic religions, the local Christians and local Muslims and local Jews of the old, here we see another discourse. 1970, Hall Lindsey published a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. This book was sold within 2 years, 28 million copies. Imagine. Claiming that all biblical prophecies show that the end of history as we know it is near. Okay, that's 3 years after 67. And thus, the second coming, with a special place reserved for Jerusalem in those unfolding events. The book became a bestseller, and as I said, sold more than 28 million copies. So here we see this other discourse. It talks about the end time, the late great planet Earth, and actually this book was turned into a film. The second discourse is always turned into film. The first discourse is turned into papers. The other one is turned into films. Okay. Again, this is typical for these two discourses. So that's the second phase. I come to the third phase, the Jerusalem Law, July 30, 1980. This is when the Knesset actually passed this law that says Jerusalem, complete and united, is the capital of Israel. Jerusalem is the seat of the president of the state, the Knesset, the government, and the Supreme Court. Remember, this is what Trump cited when he said recognizing the facts on the ground. He was talking about this. And then the holy places shall be protected from desecration and any other violation, and from anything likely to violate the freedom of access of the members of the different religions to the places sacred to them, or their feelings towards those places. So the Jerusalem Law, the first, as you remember, 1980, when Israel took this law, all the governments who had their embassies in Jerusalem, they moved them to Tel Aviv. As a reaction, a group of Christian Zionists opened that same year something called the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem. So when everyone was moving out, these Christian Zionists actually opened something they called an embassy. This became actually a very important vehicle for Christian Zionism in Jerusalem. If we look on the other discourse, 1 month later, the World Council of Churches Central Committee said, On the basis of previous World Council of Churches statement, the Central Committee opposes the Israeli unilateral action of annexing East Jerusalem and uniting the city as its eternal capital under its exclusive sovereignty. This decision is contrary to all pertinent UN resolution. It most dangerously undermines all efforts towards the just solution of the Middle East problem and thus jeopardizes regional and world peace. Just as the future status of Jerusalem has been considered part of the destiny of the Jewish people, so it cannot be considered in isolation from the destiny of the Palestinian people and should thus be determined within the general context of the settlement of the Middle East conflict in its totality. So, two totally opposing views, non-reconcilable. You cannot actually reconcile the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem with the World Council of Churches. No way. Again, it continues with the World Council. The Central Committee calls the member churches to exert through their respective government all pressure on Israel to withhold all action on Jerusalem, the future of which should be included in the agenda of the official negotiations involving Israel and the Palestinian people on self-determination and on the solution of the Middle East conflict. And here, recognizing that Jerusalem is a focus of the deepest religious inspiration and attachment for all Christians in the world, the Central Committee urges the World Council of Churches to undertake an active role in expressing the concerned Christian voice and to aid the churches in fully assuming their role as partners in deciding the future character of Jerusalem. Here we see something new, that the churches actually are asking to have a chair at the table of the negotiation, which again will come again later. We can see that. So that's the third. I come to the fourth, which is the Oslo era. You know, when Arafat, Rabin shook hands at the lane of the White House and the Oslo Accord was signed, the first thing actually that happened came from the Vatican just a few months later, December 93. No, September was the signing of the agreement. December was the Vatican fundamental agreement with Israel. So within 2 months, Israel signed this agreement the Vatican signed this agreement with Israel, and Article 4 of this agreement is the only article that talks somehow about Jerusalem. Actually, in this, it's interesting that in this document, Jerusalem is not mentioned. Jerusalem is mentioned only in the agreement with the PLO, not in the agreement with Israel. And so, but Article 4 says the State of Israel affirms its commitment to maintain and respect the status quo in the Christian communities thereunder. The Holy See affirms the Catholic Church continuing commitment to respect the aforementioned status quo and the said rights. And 1 year later, 94, the heads of churches now, for the first time, they publish a whole statement on Jerusalem. For the first time, a full statement signed by all 13 heads of churches, and it has 9 parts. I will just go quickly over them. Jerusalem is holy city for the people of the 3 monastic religion, again the same, and its unique nature of sanctity endows it with a special vocation that is meant to call for reconciliation and harmony and not for conflict and disharmony. The Arab-Israeli peace process is on its way towards reaching resolution of the conflict. They were very naive at that time, and yet Jerusalem has been sidestepped in the process, and therefore it is crucial to reflect on the core issues for resolving the conflict. Here they are saying why keeping Jerusalem for the final status negotiation. The positions of both Israeli and Palestinian sides are divergent and conflicting. History teaches us that Jerusalem cannot belong exclusively to one people. You see how many times the word exclusive comes. To one people or to only one religion. Jerusalem should be open to all, shared by all. Hence, Jerusalem has a universal and inclusive vocation. The memorandum considered the vision of Jerusalem in both the Old and New Testaments and acknowledged its foundation for all liturgical tradition and pilgrimages. Jerusalem has been home for Christians over the course of 2,000 years, and the local church with its faithful has always been actively present in the city. This continuing presence of a living Christian community is thus inseparable from the historical site. It is through the living stones that the holy archaeological sites take on life. It's again, it's talking about the people Jerusalem has two dimensions. On the one hand, it is holy city due to its link with the history of salvation. On the other hand, it's a holy city due to its local community of Christians, as well as local Muslim and Jewish communities who were born and live in the native city. And then they have their demand, right for full freedom of access to the holy site, right to come to Jerusalem to carry out pilgrimages, human rights of freedom of worship and consciousness, individuals and communities, civil and historic rights, the right to have their own institutions, and then a bit more. So this is what the churches here were saying. I will skip that. On the other hand, again, coming to the other discourse, while the churches were writing this, on the Christian Zionist side, another book was published called Left Behind. For those of you who are not aware with this, it talks about the second coming, and then some people will be raptured, others will be left behind. And this book became again a bestseller. It basically, it's not only one book, it is a series of books written between 95 and 2000. And basically they talk about the end time, what we call apocalypse in theology. Again, this series was made into film and was seen by millions. While they were, the Christian Zionism were doing that, the World Council of Churches 98 came with a full statement on Jerusalem. It says the peaceful settlement of the territorial claims of Palestinians and Israelis should respect the holiness and wholeness of the city. Access to the holy places should be free. The rights to all communities to carry their own religions must be guaranteed. Free access to Jerusalem assured. Jerusalem must remain an open and inclusive city. Jerusalem must be a shared city in terms of sovereignty and citizenship, whatever that means. And the provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention must be honored with respect to the rights of Palestinians to property, building, and residency. So, I mean, if you look at both, again, they are totally non-reconcilable. And then in 2000, the Holy See and the PLO signed this basic agreement. And there is a whole section on Jerusalem which says, calling therefore for a special status for Jerusalem, internationally guaranteed, which should safeguard the following: a freedom of religion and conscience for all, the equality before the law of the three monotheistic religions and their institutions and followers in the city, the proper identity and sacred character of the city and its universally significant religious and cultural heritage, the holy places, the freedom of access to them and of worship in them. So this is, and the regime of status quo in those holy places where it applies. This section, again, the Vatican and the PLO. I come just briefly to the last one, which is the Trump era. December 6, 2007, President Trump says it is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and to move the American embassy there. So, during the opening of the embassy in Jerusalem, I wish I could show you the video, but I will just have some quotation. There were two pastors there present who made prayers. One is Robert Jeffers. He is in Dallas, a Baptist pastor. And if we just short quotation from his prayer, he's saying, Heavenly Father, we come before you, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, thanking you for bringing us to this momentous occasion in the life of your people and the history of our world. 4,000 years ago, you said to your servant Abraham that you would make him the father of a great nation, a nation through whom the whole world would be blessed. And now, as we look back, we see how Israel has been that blessing to the entire world. The World Council of Churches actually had something against the Trump era. These two are words from the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches. He said, World Council of Churches look to the holy city of Jerusalem as the location of the foundational event at the origin of our faith. The World Council of Churches recognizes Jerusalem as a city of three faiths and two peoples. We also recognize the central, significant, and acute political, social, and religious sensitivity of the state of Jerusalem in any final and sustainable peace between the Israeli and the Palestinian. Breaks with the long-standing international consensus and almost 7 decades of established American policy. It also preempts a negotiated resolution of this most difficult issue in any final peace agreement, which must be achieved between Israel and Palestinians. But the imposition of this decision on the status of Jerusalem will only lead to more disillusionment, increased tension, and diminished hopes. The World Council of Churches call on the USAID administration to reconsider its position on this key issue and to exert its maximum efforts in promoting renewed negotiations among Israeli and Palestinians for a genuine, just, and sustainable peace. Again, two different ways of looking at things. I will continue with the Christian Zionism, because Vice President Pence is one of the Christian Zionists. And in his speech at the Knesset, when he came to announce the movement of the embassy, he said this: the Jewish people's unbreakable bond to this sacred city reaches back more than 3,000 years. It was here in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah that Abraham offered his son Isaac and was credited with righteousness for this, his faith in God. It was here in Jerusalem that King David consecrated the capital of the kingdom of Israel. And since its birth, the modern state of Israel has called this city the seat of its government. Jerusalem is Israel's capital. And to end with another quote from the other pastor who was there, John Hagee, who is the pastor in San Antonio. In his prayer, he said, "We thank you for the state of Israel, the lone torch of freedom in the Middle East, who lives and prospers because of your everlasting love for the Jewish people. It was you, O Lord, who gathered the exiles from the nations and brought them home again. It was you who made statehood possible. It was you who gave a miraculous victory in 67 when Jerusalem was reopened to worshippers of all faiths." Two different, I mean, if you hear him, it's because at the end, actually, he basically talks to and puts three groups together: ISIS, Iran, and the UN in one sentence, cursing them. So the conclusion, and I will stop here. So if we look at the Christian Zionist discourse, it talks about the biblical past. In nothing what we heard, actually, in none of those books, it has anything to do with the reality in Jerusalem today. Or if it doesn't talk about David and Abraham, it talks about the apocalyptic future left behind, end-time scenarios, and the role of Jerusalem there. And it's all about virtual reality. It's really virtual reality. But virtual reality is still a reality. That's the problem. And it has a place only for the Jewish people. They don't see anyone else. And it's an exclusive narrative. If we look at the mainline churches, Catholic, Orthodox, and mainline Protestants, we see they talk about a city with a continuous history to the present situation, a city with a continuous history. That's important. It's not we go back to 3,000 years and then it ends there. No, there was a history. Something happened between Abraham and between David to today. And they talk about the present situation. I mean, when they talk about Jerusalem, they have Christian, Jews, and Muslim, real people before their eyes, not like on the other side. And they talk about socio-historical reality, access to places, ownership of places, all these kinds of things. And they all spoke about two peoples and three religions, not only one people. And thus, it is an inclusive discourse. The problem, dear sisters and brothers, and I would like to end with there, is that if you think with your rationality, with Christian values, with human values, with international law, you think this discourse here to the right makes sense. Unfortunately, we are living in a time where virtual reality is the reality, and where exclusive, actually, discourses, if it's Trump, if it's Putin, if it's Netanyahu, etc., is unfortunately the trend that is leading the world today. And so we are still between these two discourses, the rational and the apocalyptic discourse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very scary presentation, Mitri. I think when we talk about fragmentation, then I think your presentation definitely helped us understand that there's also a broadening gap between church institutions and those who claim to represent the churches. So thank you very much. When we talk about the present or the current presence of Christians in the city of Jerusalem, then we have to highlight that there are more than 100, I think that we're talking about 130 Christian organizations being active in the charity sector, in the healthcare sector, and especially educational sector. And thanks to the work to which Maher contributed, we have some very interesting empirical findings on what these organizations do and what they think and how they contribute to this inclusive approach, as Mitri has put it. So Maher, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
To introduce myself. I am a statistician at Near East Consulting Company, the company that has conducted the study about the role of Christian institutions in East Jerusalem. As a statistician, you have to expect that I will talk about statistical descriptions and issues. Okay, so in my presentation, I will give descriptions on study methodology, the obstacles that encountered or faced the fieldwork team, some results from study, and essential information obtained about the role of Christian institutions in important sectors: health, education, human rights, tourists, jobs, opportunities. The study covered the Christian institutions that exist in East Jerusalem. And these institutions were prepared from several sources on internet and put in a list with addresses and phone numbers. The number of these institutions was estimated at 130. Among these institutions, only 68 answered the questionnaire. So the results of the study reflect only those that answered the questionnaire. The questionnaire covered the following: the identification and contact information of the institution, name, address, phone number, email, and the name of the institution head. the characteristics of the institution, which are type of the services provided, church affiliated or not affiliated, establishment year, the institution's registration, source of funding, budget, main international evaluation. The characteristics and distributions of beneficiaries, age categories, young people, adult and old people, gender, males, females, religion, Christian and non-Christian, the characteristics of staff, the workers, and distributions according to gender and religion. The evaluation or cooperation of the institution with other institutions in Jerusalem or with other governorates in Palestine and with institutions inside Israel. The data collection was in two methods: face-to-face interviews, telephone interviews. Many institutions refused to cooperate in either method. The number of institutions, as I said before, that responded was 68, and the number of non-responsive institutions was 62. The purpose of this study: we know that the Christian institutions provide many services to serve the Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, as well as Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This research or study is to assess the extent of their role and the type of services they provide. And as I said before, the results reflect only the services of the institutions that responded positively to the questionnaire. Now I will show some results as general background about the institutions. First here, this figure shows the percentage of institutions according to the year of establishment. We have three categories: before 1948, between 1948 and 67, and after 1967. The highest percentage, as we see, the institutions that established after 1967. And next, the institutions established before 1948. Here, the numbers and percentages of institutions according to church or sect the institution belonged to, and we have a category for non-sect institutions. The highest percentage for institutions which belong to Catholic or Latin. Next, Greek Orthodox, Lutheran, Evangelical, and others. Okay. Here, the figures for source of funding. According to this, we have the percentage of institutions funded from each source. We have 7 sources. The percentage here reflect the proportion of institutions that funded by the source out of all the responded institutions, the 68 institutions. The sum of the percentage will not be 100% because the percentages are calculated out of the responded institutions.
What do you mean by the Arab Church?
Okay. Okay. Funding from the Arab Church. We will check with this. Okay. Because we have local financing through the service provided from the Arab churches. So the category there from the Arab countries, maybe something.
Which countries?
Arab countries. In the study, the country was not mentioned, but the answer for this category, Arab countries, without any details. Here the figure for registration type describe the percentages for each registration type. 4 categories: Israeli, under church name, international registration, 2 registration, Palestinians and international. As we see, the highest percentage for registration under church name. Next, 2 registration, Palestinian and international. And the others, Israeli and international registration. Here, the figure, the percentages according to main international relations. We have categories of international relations for countries: Germany, France, United States, Greece, more than 1 country, and others. The highest percentage for more than 1 country.
Is there anything from Russia?
Others. We don't know because not specified in the study if Russia or other country. Okay. Here the figure, the percentage for the churches or the institutions that provide services to Christians only. We have 25% of institutions that provide services to Christians only. The others, 75%, that provide services for Christians and non-Christians. Here, the figure represents the percentage of institutions that evaluated with the institutions in other governorates inside Palestine. We have 38% said that evaluated to other institutions in other governorates inside Palestine. Here, the figure for the percentage of institutions that evaluated with institution inside Israel, 25%. Here, the figure represents the percentage of institutions that follow a major institution within Jerusalem, like the patriarchal school, agriculture, and intellectual club that follows a monastery, with the percentage 52%. Okay. Now we come to the results concerning the services. This figure represents the percentage of services that provided according to the services type. I should say here that the question about the services was multiple response, which means the institution may have more than one response positively as yes for the service. For example, the institution may provide a service for cultural type and training and other services maybe. So here the percentage represent the percentage of responses on the service sector from all responses on the services as yes. The sum of percentages 100%. The other figure about services, here the percentage on the service type represent the percentage of institutions that provide service out of the responded institutions, the 68 institutions. The sum of the percentages will not be 100%. The essential information that obtained on health services, we have out of the 4 major hospitals in East Jerusalem, 3 are church-affiliated hospitals. Augusta Victoria, St. John Ophthalmic Hospital, St. Joseph's General Hospital. These hospitals are well known in East Jerusalem. The 3 hospitals provide healthcare services to all Palestinians, regardless of religion, race, sex, cultural, or economic status who reside in Jerusalem, as well as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The services include, among other services, cancer care, hematology and bone marrow, transplantation, kidney dialysis, general surgery, ENT, eye care, diabetes, mother and child care, and others. The data collected from the health centers reveals that 246,415 patients receive treatment per year. Education sector, we have 88 public schools in East Jerusalem, 97 recognized but unofficial schools, and 79 private schools. church-affiliated schools are one of the main providers of education in East Jerusalem. The results also showed that 82 of the schools that answered the question provide high-level education, secondary stage education to the students. 1,403 students get vocational training and courses by these Christian institutions. The Christian formal schools that answered the questionnaire provide education services to 5,478 students.
Maher, I'm sorry. I'm ending this now. Sorry for that.
The other sectors,
I think
we have some results that I couldn't.
Yeah, I'm sorry for
Short
that, but due
to
to
you.
time constraints, I would suggest,
Okay.
suggest that we thank you first of all for this presentation. And allow also the audience to step in at this point. And I would like to call Khafeeir and Mitri back to the panel so that we can collect one round of questions before we then have to continue already. So I see a first question here, and I think we need the mic for translation. And the second one there is. It's the fifth row on the side.
Thank you very much. I'm Jessica from the Church of Sweden, and I would like to ask you, maybe it was a part of the presentation, but we didn't have time for it, but I would like to know if you check the statistics of the staff, how many people are actually employed in the organizations and how many of them are Christians?
I would suggest that we collect questions. So the gentleman in the third row here had another question. Yes.
Oh, thank you. For Khafeeir, in fact, Khafeeir, I appreciated your well done, well prepared paper, but I want small comments here. First of all, the Balfour Declaration and the reason of Balfour Declaration, it was in fact the need of the British for the Jewish lobbies in America and Russia, for the second to help them, especially in America, to enter the Second World War. They entered 6 months before the end of the Second World War. And they were very influential also in Russia before and after the Communist Revolution. So this is major reason for Balfour Declaration. While I saw books, I taught the Palestine cause for 15 years. I saw books saying rubbish because sympathy or because he invented, because Chaim Weizmann invented the bombs, something like that. Isa al-Isa was a famous journalist from Jerusalem, and he was against the Balfour Declaration but supported the British. In fact, most of Palestinians, especially nationalists, especially the people of the Hajj Amin Husseini, they were against the Jews only. But the communists and the Asbat al-Taharrur, the National League of 1943, they always told them their main enemy is the British. Without the British, the Zionists would have not become so strong and cannot overtake the country. So it was a big strategic mistake by the nationalists of Palestinian nationalists at that time. And
Do you have a question?
No,
If not,
no. It's
okay.
comment.
Maybe we move on.
Comments as
Unfortunately,
I
I have to play this dirty role of keeping everybody short. So in that case, I would continue with another question, which is in the back over there. I'll let you run a bit. Sorry for that.
This is a long day, and you have to greet all the participants. But I think the third temple has been built a while ago. The third temple is Mount Gerizim in Nablus. The story of Abraham comes in 3 accounts. Abraham was the father of Ismail and Hajar as well, the husband of Ismail. Then you have the temple of Jerusalem. Then you have the third temple. But about this issue of the coming of the Messiah, we should spread the note that according to the Samaritans, this will happen in 29,000 years. The coming will happen formally, in 29,000 years. And the way out of all this conflict is very simple. Either we tell the Lord, welcome again, or we just tell him, welcome, we've been waiting for you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any further questions, so I would like to give this back to... Oh, there's one more, sorry. Please.
Thank you. Reverend Mutri Rahab, I would like to hear an assessment from your part regarding the local churches or the mainstream churches in the Holy Land refuting or responding to the Zionist Christian biblical views regarding Jerusalem and the establishment of the State of Israel. And what do you think about that? And if there was a response to begin with. And to Mr. Maher, I would like to ask whether the survey covered the whole of Jerusalem, east and west, or only East Jerusalem, because from your data about the hospitals, it seems it's only East Jerusalem. But I believe that the number of institutions is too exaggerated when you say 130, because I think in the whole of Jerusalem it's about 136 maybe.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so one quick question. 10 seconds, I count. Then even 15 seconds.
So, Dr. Mutri, you very correctly and in a vast explanation showed us their declarations of the church within several periods, and it was hectic and it was accumulated. So what was the result? Did they bring any result for Palestinians and for Palestine?
Thank you very much. I suggest that Mutri starts, and then we go from left to right.
Okay, regarding Ishmael, I have in the study a section on that because it's Vice President Pence who mentions in his speech at the Knesset at some point Ishmael. And he mentions it and say, he comes to speak about the Arab countries. So what I'm saying is that Ishmael is for me not a relief, because what happens is actually, if you see the biblical story, Isaac is actually set over Ishmael. It doesn't matter. What happens in America is that white supremacy is actually connected with Isaac, and so the anti-Muslim, anti-Arab sentiments are connected to Ishmael. So it doesn't help to say Ishmael was, because in this discourse, Zionist discourse, you have anyhow this white supremacy. So it doesn't help at all. It's actually counterproductive. The second thing, is there a response to the Zionists? There was some attempts, there were several conferences. There was one book published by the Middle East Council of Churches on Zionism, Christian Zionism, and Sabil published one book about Christian Zionism. But again, the thing is, you really cannot respond to, because these are on totally different levels. You cannot, with our rationality or with the way we read the Bible, come to speak to them. It's like you cannot, it's just, these are two different waves, and they never meet. They cannot meet. You can talk to them forever. Unfortunately, there is no response. And here, unfortunately, I think that the Zionist discourse was talking about virtual reality, but all the time they were creating that virtual reality. So they were talking about David, for example. It's nice. But then they create the city of David. They expel the Palestinians from Silwan. Then suddenly you have the city of David that actually attracts all these pilgrims and so on. So it starts with a virtual reality, but that virtual reality is translated through politics, hard politics, into actual reality. And that's, I think, the danger. While the churches, they speak nice things, but they have not the capacity to translate that into real. Yeah, they can maybe, but they don't. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Mutri, and it's now to Khafeeir. Thank you.
Dr. Abdullah, I think I mentioned that Isa was actually pro-British, but he was not pro-British throughout all the mandate. In fact, there is a quote after Patriarch Timotheus is elected in 1931, where he writes in Palestine, "It is true that Palestine is under two mandates, one the British and the other the Zionist. And it is true that the Orthodox community is under three mandates, the British, the Zionist, and thirdly, the Greek." So he ends up comparing the occupation of Palestine from the Brits to the Greeks to the Zionists, as the three of them being a part of the same alliance. And I don't think I mentioned that the Balfour Declaration came to birth because Mr. Balfour was a Protestant or was a Christian Zionist, but he was clearly influenced by his own formation as an evangelical Christian. Of course, there are many other issues that influenced, and it was mainly politics. But it's also important to understand the lobby that Christian Zionists, for example, exercised in the US back at that time in order to allow the UK to go ahead with the Balfour Declaration. I mean, it was not only about the Christian Zionists in the UK, it was also about a global movement that was being created. And even if we want to go up in the 30s and 40s, there were Christian organizations all over, including, for example, in places like Latin America, that were created to support first the creation of the Jewish state or the partition of Palestine. So clearly, it's a political issue. I'm not arguing at all that it's a religious issue. However, there is a religious dimension that in this case, at least Balfour and other, that I can't remember now, but other British leaders that were either both Jewish Zionists or Christian Zionists, that gave them a lot of enthusiasm to support the Balfour Declaration.
Thank you very much, Javier. And then there were two empirical questions for Maher.
Okay. Yes, there were two questions. The first question about the number of staff as a Christian and non-Christian. In the study, we have two questions in the questionnaire. One question about the total workers or staff, and the other one, the percentage of Christians among the staff. Therefore, we could have numbers of workers for Christians and non-Christians from the study, yes. But we haven't shown the results. But we could obtain a table for Christian and non-Christian numbers, and this will be added to the report of the study. The time was not enough to show many results in the report. What I have shown, only some results.
So you see, this is the little advertisement for the book that will be published after the conference.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
The second question.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was summing up
I
because
haven't
I know the answer
finished
already, sorry.
yet. About if the study covered the institutions, East Jerusalem or West, as you said. The study cover East Jerusalem only, institutions that exist in East Jerusalem. They mentioned hospitals, Augusta Victoria, ophthalmic hospital, and St. Joseph. All are in East Jerusalem.
Thank you very much. We do thank you once again to the great presentations. I think it really helped understand the current situation, and we will continue the conversation on the Christian Jerusalem with the next panel, which will start in 5 minutes. So it's only a quick break. Yeah, so please be back in time 5:45, so that we continue. Yeah. Also mental exercise.
Yeah,
and
there
then
is
we
no
continue.
coffee outside, so don't be tempted to go outside.
Yeah.
Just take some exercise here, and we invite the speakers to come here. I know it's a long day.
Thank you.
And